It was one of those deceptively calm Saturday mornings, where everything seemed in its place. The birds were chirping, the air smelled like fresh-cut grass, and the faint hum of a lawnmower drifted in from a neighbor's house down the block. I had just poured myself a steaming cup of coffee, savoring the rich, bitter warmth, when I heard it, a firm knock on the door, sharp and purposeful. It wasn't the casual knock of a delivery person, nor the friendly rap of a neighbor stopping by. This was different, the kind of knock that suggests something serious, or worse, something unexpected. I set my coffee down on the counter, wiping my hands on the dish towel. My first thought was that it was the HOA, but that didn't make sense. The last time I'd heard from them was months ago, and I hadn't received any notices or complaints recently. Besides, the house was in perfect shape. No overgrown lawns, no loud parties, no suspicious-looking lawn gnomes, nothing to warrant a visit from them. But then again, the HOA had a way of finding problems where none existed. I walked slowly to the door, my mind turning over possible reasons for their sudden appearance. When I opened it, the last thing I expected to see were two police officers standing on my porch. Both were dressed in dark blue uniforms, their shiny badges glinting in the sunlight. They stood a little too stiffly for a casual encounter, and their expressions were a bit too serious for my liking. One was taller, probably in his mid-30s, and had a buzz cut that made him look like he spent most of his time in the gym. The other officer was shorter, stockier, and older, probably pushing 50, with a gray beard that made him look like he'd been on the force for years. They both looked at me with the kind of professional detachment I'd seen many times in the past when my wife had brought work home with her. It was the face of people who didn't want to get personal. "Good morning, sir," the taller officer said, his voice smooth, but his eyes scanning the house as if searching for something to justify his presence. "We're here in response to a complaint from your HOA." I blinked. "HOA," I echoed, trying to make sense of what he was saying. "What complaint?" "We've been asked to investigate a possible violation on your property," the officer continued, his tone polite, but there was something in his demeanor that suggested he wasn't used to handling this kind of thing. Maybe he thought this whole situation was ridiculous too. I could feel a frown forming on my face as I tried to piece together the puzzle. "I don't know what you're talking about. No one's called me, and everything's in order around here. My yard's fine, no loud noises, and I haven't had a single complaint. If the HOA wants to talk to me about something, they can call, right?" The officer didn't respond immediately. Instead, he glanced at his partner, who was watching me intently, like they both expected me to break down and confess something. It felt off. I had no idea what the HOA might be accusing me of, but this didn't seem like the way they typically handled things. They were usually much more bureaucratic, more official. A little letter in the mailbox, a formal warning, nothing that would involve law enforcement. "I understand, sir," the taller officer finally said, breaking my thoughts. "But we were instructed to investigate, and we need to check the property to ensure there are no violations." I was still trying to wrap my head around the situation when I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Something about the way they were standing on my doorstep felt almost too forceful, like they were trying to intimidate me into something. "So you're saying the HOA sent you here?" "That's correct, sir," the shorter officer spoke up for the first time, his voice a little more gravelly. "We were told to follow up on their complaint. It's part of the procedure." "Look," I said, a little more firmly now, "I'm not trying to be difficult, but this doesn't make any sense. You're telling me that the HOA called you for a simple violation, and now I've got police officers showing up at my door." I paused, my frustration starting to bubble to the surface. I've been a homeowner here for years, and I've never had issues with the HOA before. If there's something wrong, they can send a letter or a notice. The officers exchanged a brief look before the taller one responded again. "Like I said, sir, we're just following protocol. We'll need to take a look around, check things out." I opened my mouth to respond, but before I could, I heard footsteps coming down the hallway behind me. I turned to see my wife walking toward the door, the clink of her boots on the floor echoing in the silence. She had just gotten home from her shift and hadn't even had time to change out of her uniform. Her presence was like flipping a switch. Suddenly, everything about the situation changed. The officers stiffened, their eyes immediately locking onto her as she approached. "Is there a problem, honey?" she asked, her voice casual, but her sharp eyes already taking in the scene. I watched as the two officers froze, clearly not expecting her to appear. My wife, Detective Samantha Hayes, had been with the department for over 10 years. She had the kind of presence that demanded respect, whether you liked her or not. But even without her badge, she exuded authority. Today, she was in full uniform, gun holstered at her side, badge clipped to her belt, her black jacket gleaming in the sunlight. The officers glanced at each other, clearly unsure of how to proceed. I couldn't help but feel a little smug. No one ever expected her to be the one answering the door, and I had a feeling these officers were regretting it now. "What's going on?" she repeated, her voice cutting through the awkward silence. The two officers stood frozen on the doorstep, their eyes darting back and forth between my wife and me, clearly caught off guard by her appearance. For a brief moment, it felt like time had slowed down. The tall officer cleared his throat, his previous confidence now replaced with an awkward uncertainty. He straightened his posture as if trying to regain some control over the situation. My wife, Samantha, didn't even flinch. She stood there, her posture relaxed but firm, her arms crossed casually over her chest as if she had all the time in the world. She'd seen this kind of thing before, people intimidated by her presence. But these officers, they weren't just intimidated, they were rattled. "Is there a problem, gentlemen?" Samantha's voice was smooth, calm, but with an edge that made it clear she wasn't about to tolerate any nonsense. The taller officer swallowed and then tried to regain his composure. No, ma'am. We were just here to follow up on a complaint from your HOA. It seems there might be some, violation of neighborhood rules that requires immediate attention." His words were measured, almost too careful. I could see the nervous twitch in his eyes. He wasn't just talking to a homeowner now. He was talking to a seasoned detective, someone who could easily slice through his half-formed answers like a hot knife through butter. Samantha glanced at me, her expression unreadable, then returned her gaze to the officers. "A complaint, huh?" she said, raising an eyebrow. "And what kind of violation are we talking about here?" The shorter officer, who had been quiet up until now, stepped forward. His voice was a little shakier than before. "Well, ma'am, we don't have the specifics. We were just told to investigate and make sure everything checks out. We're following protocol." His eyes darted around as if looking for a quick exit from this increasingly awkward situation. Samantha's lips pressed into a tight smile, the kind that made me a little nervous. She was getting to the heart of things, and the officers knew it. They could feel the shift in the atmosphere. This was no longer a simple visit about a neighborhood complaint. This was about authority, and Samantha had the upper hand. "And you thought," she continued, her tone still calm but firm, "that the best way to handle a neighborhood violation was to send two officers to a resident's home without any prior warning or official notice." Her eyes never left the officers as she spoke, her voice a perfect mix of professionalism and disbelief. "Are you telling me this is standard procedure?" The officers exchanged a look, and I could almost see the gears turning in their heads. Neither of them had expected this. They'd come here, assuming they could simply pass on the message from the HOA and be done with it. Maybe they thought a little intimidation would get the job done. But now, faced with a seasoned professional, they were second-guessing their entire approach. The taller officer seemed to hesitate, but he managed to push through. "Ma'am, we're just doing our job. We're not here to cause trouble, but we do need to make sure everything is in order." Samantha raised an eyebrow, a slight smirk playing at the corners of her mouth. "In order," she repeated. "So you're telling me that the HOA's complaint is so serious that it warranted involving the police?" At this, the shorter officer visibly shifted on his feet, as if the very idea of this situation becoming more complicated was too much for him. "Well, it's standard procedure if the violation is something more significant. Like an unapproved structure or something that could affect the safety of the neighborhood." I could see my wife's eyes narrowing slightly, but she didn't interrupt. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, considering his words. "Unapproved structure. Is that what you're investigating?" Now it was the tall officer's turn to fumble. We don't know. That's what we need to check for, ma'am." The HOA didn't provide details. Samantha's smile didn't waver, but I could tell she was losing patience. "And you're just going to walk around my property, on my private property, without any specifics?" without an actual notice from the HOA. The officers were starting to look more and more uncomfortable. The taller one shifted his weight from one foot to the other, clearly trying to maintain control of the situation, but he was no longer sure of himself. The tension was palpable. I could almost hear the mental wheels turning in his head as he processed the fact that this wasn't just a routine visit. This was becoming a problem. "I'm sorry, ma'am," the shorter officer finally said, his voice quieter now. "We didn't mean to overstep. We were just following up on the HOA's request. We thought it was a simple formality." Samantha's expression softened slightly, though there was still a sharpness to her words. "A simple formality?" she asked, her voice laced with incredulity. "Do you think that's how this works? You show up at someone's door with nothing but a vague claim and expect them to just let you onto their property?" The tall officer seemed to deflate, his posture slumping slightly. The power dynamics had shifted entirely. They weren't in control anymore. Samantha didn't give them a chance to respond. "Here's what's going to happen," she said, her voice steady but authoritative. "You're going to go back to the HOA, and you're going to ask them for the specifics of the complaint. Until then, you're not stepping 1 foot onto my property." There was a long silence as the officers stood there, unsure of how to respond. Finally, the taller officer cleared his throat and nodded. We'll get back to them, ma'am," he said, almost in a whisper. Samantha nodded once, sharply, as if signaling the end of the conversation. "Good," she said, her tone leaving no room for negotiation. "And if there's a next time, make sure you have all the facts before you come knocking on my door." The officers stood there for another moment, looking at each other as if they were waiting for some kind of sign. Then, almost in unison, they turned and walked off the porch, their footsteps heavy as they retreated down the front path. As they disappeared into the street, I could feel the tension finally ease from my shoulders. Samantha turned back to me, her expression softening as she gave me a playful, knowing look. "Some people need a reminder about who's really in charge," she said, her voice light but carrying that edge of authority that I'd come to admire so much. I couldn't help but chuckle. "I think they learned their lesson." She smiled, then shook her head, the corners of her eyes crinkling in that way that always made her look like she was trying not to laugh. "They'll be talking about this for a while." "Yeah, well," I said, "at least we won't be getting any more surprise visits from the HOA anytime soon." She raised her coffee mug with a knowing smile. "Not unless they want a lesson in manners." The sound of the officer's retreating footsteps echoed in the quiet of the morning air as they walked down the driveway, their boots tapping a rhythm of retreat. My wife, Samantha, stood motionless at the door, her eyes locked on the officers' backs, until they were well out of sight. Her expression was unreadable, the calm mask of a professional covering whatever thoughts were running through her mind. But I knew her well enough to see the faint tension in her shoulders, the subtle release that came after a showdown like that. "Is it over?" I asked, stepping closer to her, a grin slowly forming on my face despite the tension of the moment. Samantha turned toward me, her lips curling into that knowing half-smile she wore when she was both amused and satisfied. "For now," she said, the words laced with that dangerous calm. "But I suspect they'll be keeping a closer eye on us from now on." I leaned against the doorframe, feeling a rush of relief. I've never seen two grown men freeze up like that. I don't think they knew what hit them. She chuckled, her gaze softening as she looked me over. They didn't expect a detective to be answering the door. Especially not one who's trained to spot a power play when she sees it. She walked past me, her boots clicking against the hardwood floor as she headed toward the kitchen. "It's been a while since anyone's tried something that ridiculous, but I have to say, I kind of enjoyed it." I followed her into the kitchen, where she poured herself a fresh cup of coffee, the warm steam rising in a cloud of comfort. As she did, I reflected on the surrealness of the encounter. It hadn't been an average knock on the door. Hell, it hadn't been an average Saturday. The whole thing felt like a bad joke, two officers sent to my house over a vague HOA complaint, only to be met by a woman who, if they'd done their homework, they would have known was more than capable of handling them. And in the end, it was almost laughable how quickly they'd backed down when she'd shown up in her uniform. I couldn't help but laugh, shaking my head in disbelief. "I've never been so glad you're on my side. Those guys looked like they were about to faint the second they saw you." Samantha took a sip of her coffee, her eyes twinkling with mischief. Well, maybe next time they'll think twice before sending the cops to handle something that's clearly a civil issue. The law had no business involving them in the first place. I leaned against the counter, crossing my arms, feeling a mix of pride and amusement. What were they even trying to do? They didn't have a specific complaint, no real reason to be there. And they didn't even have a proper notice. They just showed up and hoped they could get away with it. That's exactly it, she said, her tone more serious now. It's a power move. People do it all the time, especially in these situations. The law probably thought they could use the cops as a way to pressure us into complying without question. But if there's one thing I can't stand, it's people thinking they can intimidate others into submission. She paused, her gaze hardening. And when the police are involved, it's even worse. You don't use law enforcement to get your way on something as trivial as a neighborhood dispute. I nodded, watching as she set the coffee mug down, her eyes focused on the window, her thoughts clearly drifting elsewhere. There was something about her presence, when she was in full control, when she was confident in her authority, that made me realize how much of her job she had to deal with. How often she saw people abuse their power or overstep their bounds, using intimidation to get what they wanted. Do you think they'll try something again? I asked, my curiosity getting the better of me. I was still processing the fact that the law had escalated a minor issue to such an absurd level. Samantha's gaze didn't leave the window, her fingers tapping idly on the edge of the counter. It's possible, she said slowly. The law has a history of being aggressive when it comes to enforcing their rules. But now they've learned something valuable. They know not to mess with me. They know I won't just roll over when they decide to make a nuisance of themselves. She turned her head to meet my eyes, her expression a mixture of resolve and something else, maybe a bit of amusement, too. And if they do, I'll make sure they understand that I don't tolerate anyone trying to play games with the law. They might have power in the neighborhood, but they don't get to use the police as pawns. Not on my watch. The determination in her voice left no room for doubt. I could feel the weight of her words sink in. Samantha had always been a fighter, but in moments like this, I realized just how deeply her sense of justice ran. It wasn't just about doing her job, it was about protecting what was right. No one got to push her or anyone else around. I smiled, feeling a swell of pride. I don't know what's scarier, the thought of the law after you, or you going full detective mode on them. She grinned, a wicked sparkle in her eyes. Trust me, honey. The law might try to cause problems again, but I'm pretty sure they're regretting this little stunt already. She leaned back against the counter, folding her arms. I'll be keeping an eye on them, just in case. And if they send anyone else, cops or otherwise, they'll get the same treatment. As she spoke, I could almost picture the whole scenario playing out in her head. Samantha wasn't someone who took things lying down, and she had a way of handling problems that left no room for anyone to doubt her authority. The officers had learned that lesson the hard way. There was a brief pause before she let out a small, satisfied sigh and took another sip of coffee. Well, if nothing else, I hope this serves as a reminder to the law. If you want to get something done, you'd better come with more than just a complaint. You'd better have the facts, and you'd better be prepared to deal with the consequences. I couldn't help but laugh at that. Oh, they've definitely learned that lesson. I can't imagine they'll be rushing to send the cops again anytime soon. She raised her mug, her eyes flicking over to me, and smiled. Not unless they want a lesson in manners. I'm not some pushover they can push around just because they've got a few rules to enforce. They can keep their petty complaints, and I'll keep my peace. But if they try this again, they'll wish they hadn't. I nodded, a grin spreading across my face as I joined her at the counter. The whole morning had been a strange roller coaster, but as far as I was concerned, it had ended with a pretty satisfying result. Samantha had handled that situation with the kind of calm authority that only she could manage. The law, and the two officers, had learned the hard way that not all power plays go as planned. And I had learned, once again, that when it came to protecting our home, there was no one I'd rather have by my side.